Hello everyone, this is Cabane the Christian. Today I want to talk a little bit about the biblical concept of the development of society and how that relates to the nature of the state and what kind of state that the Bible prescribes, if it prescribes any kind at all. Now, I'm going to be upfront and I'm going to say that insofar as we want to talk about a centralized state or a central government, a government that covers more than one city, I'm a monarchist. I don't believe in republicanism. I don't believe in democracy. I think traditional monarchy is the way to go. I also want to say that just because I'm a traditional monarchist doesn't mean that I support a massive overbearing government. In fact, I think that democratic republicanism is more conducive to overbearing government. Hans Hermann Hoppe, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, argues this as well, saying that libertarians should be traditional monarchists because libertarianism is more compatible with traditional monarchy. I'm not saying I'm a doctrinaire libertarian. There's some aspects of it I roll with. There's some aspects I don't roll with, but that's my perspective on that. But what I want to really talk about today is how the Bible conceives of this, of the state, and how it conceives of the state changing and developing over time. The first thing we have to understand when we talk about this is that the biblical understanding of the state is not different from or it's not unrelated to the biblical understanding of society. The state is not conceived of as something completely separate from the structuring of society. That's why I think, for example, that as America stands today, a traditional monarchy would not work, because a traditional monarchy is part and parcel of a broader concept of the biblical vision of society, and that relates to things like clients and patrons and the networks that they create throughout a whole social order. A client, a patron, and a client are in a relationship which is conceived of as familial. The patron is conceived of as a sort of father to his client. He gives benefits, he gives privileges to his client. The client receives those, uses them wisely, and then gives thanksgiving to his patron. He reciprocates and consecrates something back to him. God is the divine king, is the patron of the human race. He gives the human race a gift by creating the world. The human race receives it with thanksgiving. It molds it, it transfigures it, it develops it as the image of God, and then it consecrates that back to God with thanksgiving. And the way in which humanity does that in the Bible is by giving a tithe on the increase of their produce. This is a very interesting kind of point here, because increasing the value of things is not done by creating more matter ex nihilo. If you just think economically, to increase the value of something means you put in your labor and your mental energy in molding it into something other than what it is. So silicon, just as a substance, is not worth very much. But when human beings with their minds, which reflect the rational logos, the image of God, mold silicon into a computer chip, its value massively increases. And that is why I believe that you see so much economic language in the Bible. Deuteronomy 8 talks about God giving Israel the power to get wealth. Paul repeatedly speaks of God's glory in these terms, the riches of his glory. 2 Corinthians speaks of the riches of God's glory and thanksgiving in the context of Paul's monetary offering to Jerusalem. And this is why in the Divine Liturgy, the tithe is offered up and consecrated after the consecration of the Eucharistic gifts. Those two things are very deeply woven together. Eventually, I'll make another video talking about how this plays out over the whole Bible, because economic language and terminology is central to the Bible's understanding of God's relationship with humankind. And you can see that, for example, in the prominence of talk about investment and stuff in the parables of the Lord Jesus. So I wanted to make that point about the structure of society, because the monarchy or the royal family is understood to be the patron of the whole nation, and most directly the patron of the aristocracy, who has wealth, and God gives them wealth in order that they might manage it wisely and use it to bless the whole society, and then they are directly under the patronage of the king. So how does society develop in the Bible? Because we do see in the book of Judges a period where Israel is not under a traditional monarchy. And how are we supposed to understand this? Well, I want to set forth three stages to the development of a society and the state that we see in the scripture. The first stage corresponds with the priestly period of covenant history. If you remember, we've talked about how history is a upward spiral of the repeating pattern of priestly, royal, and prophetic, corresponding to Father, Son, and Spirit. The priestly period of covenant history is where you are directly under the tutelage of God as your father, and your responsibility is to listen to what he tells you to do and to do exactly as he said. You don't have to understand it. You're not supposed to add on to it. You just listen to what you're told to do specifically and do exactly as you're told. This is a kind of a covenantal childhood. This is the period of the Mosaic covenant before it is transformed under the kingdom of David. Under the Mosaic covenant, the priests are given very specific instructions in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. While they look complex to us, if this is something you're doing every day, you're going to get the hang of it very, very quickly. It's not actually that complex, but they're given very specific and exact instructions. They're not supposed to add on to it or develop it. The kingly period is where you have now been doing these things for so long, you've habituated them, and as you've habituated them, you've come to mentally digest them. You've come to understand why God gave the commandments he did, and you come to reason out from those commandments to their implications. And that's what wisdom is all about. When you govern by wisdom, you're not given a specific instruction from God for every single situation. Instead, you have to make deductions and reason forth. So just to give you the earliest example of this, remember that God created man to grow in wisdom and to eventually inherit the earth and rule over the whole thing. Now, why did the serpent try to deceive Eve? Now, serpent means nakash, or is the word nakash. That's as a noun, it's rendered serpent, but as an adjective, it means bright. Just like the word seraph as a noun means serpent, but as an adjective means burning. So this is a bright heavenly being with serpentine in appearance. So this is Satan, and we generally call pre-fall Satan Lucifer. I don't think he's fallen yet, because when God creates humanity, he says his world is very good. The angels were created on the first day. It says God created the heavens and the earth. That's not the heavens which is created on the second day, which is a symbol of the invisible heavens. The heavens of the first day are God's throne room, what Solomon calls the heaven of heavens. And you can see this when Paul speaks of heaven and earth in Colossians 1, where he includes the angelic hosts in the heavens. So the angels are unfallen when God creates man. So I think that when Adam and Eve are in the garden, Satan, this heavenly being, the bright one, approaches Adam and Eve, who are approaching the tree of life to have their first meal with God. Now, the first thing he does is he asks them a question. He says, are you not allowed to eat any tree of the garden? This is not a deception. He's asking them a question in order to provoke them to reflect on God's commandment. This is what God does throughout the scripture. You look at Genesis 18 and 19, you look at Exodus 32, 33, and 34. You look at Numbers, you look at God's conversation with Job in Job 38 to 42, where he says, gird your loins and have this discussion with me, debate me, and therefore meditate on God's creative wisdom to learn wisdom yourself. So that's the first thing that happens here when the bright one asks Eve this question. But what she says is what provokes him to deceive Eve. Because what she says is, we are not allowed to eat of the tree of knowledge, neither shall we touch it. Neither shall we touch it. That was not given as a commandment specifically, but it is an implication of the commandment. If you're not supposed to do something, it's not wise to get as close as you can to do it. Because that will lead to temptation. The principle of connecting eating and touching is also in Leviticus, where foods you're not supposed to eat, you're also not supposed to touch those animals. So God created man for a little while lower than the angels, but eventually man was supposed to judge angels, as St. Paul says. When Satan saw that Eve was growing in wisdom, he didn't want Eve and Adam to be exalted over him, so he engineered a deception, and that's where he actually tells an explicit lie. That's the first example in the Bible of growing in wisdom. You also see it in the time of David and Solomon. David publishes a 5-book of Psalms. I think the original Psalter was about half the size of the Psalter we have, but nevertheless, I think every psalm, by the way, that says of David, that was part of the original Psalter. There are other psalms which are by David, but presumably they were integrated into the book later in history, just like some Proverbs of Solomon and Proverbs 25 and forward were added to Proverbs in the days of Hezekiah. Anyway, there's a 5-book Psalter that matches the 5-book Torah. David digests the Torah. He says, I love your law. It is my meditation all the day long. And then he spits out song and wisdom based on the Torah. David sets up a Levitical orchestra. The Levitical orchestra is not specifically commanded by God. Nevertheless, the chronicler, whom I believe is Ezra, speaks of it as if it is sacred. David was not wrong to set up the Levitical orchestra. He's digested the words of God, and now by wisdom he is glorifying that worship. And the instruments, the musical instruments at the temple, are described in the same terms as the sacred objects in the tabernacle. So in the tabernacle you have holy water, you've got holy knives, you've got sacred utensils. Same word is used in Chronicles. The instruments are holy utensils. David has digested the words of God and now has glorified it by wisdom. Solomon does the same thing. Just as God brought all the animals to Adam in pairs, and Adam reasoned forward from that, knowing that he also was to have a pair like him. We know that they were in pairs, by the way, because that's what happens to Noah. All the animals come 2 by 2, and Noah is a new Adam. That story has all sorts of connections with the original Adam. But all the animals come to Solomon. We hear about that in Kings. And after God brings all the animals to Solomon, he brings the Queen of Sheba to Solomon, which matches God's bringing Eve to Adam just as he meditated on all the animals. Solomon writes a book of Proverbs. In the book of Proverbs, it's got lots and lots of lessons given from the ways of the animals. I believe he also wrote Job, which speaks of the same thing. There are lessons given from the ways of the animals in Job 38 to 42. But the point here is that we're digesting the Word of God, we're coming to understand why God gave the commandments he did, and we learn wisdom thereby. When those 2 prostitutes came to Solomon in order for him to render the verdict on whose child it was, that was not a situation for which God gave explicit instruction in the Pentateuch. He had to reason from the principles in the Pentateuch and render right judgment on that. Now, a prophetic period in Israel's history, and by the way, the royal period corresponds to the sun because God rules through the sun. The sun is enthroned as the king over all the earth. And then the prophetic period corresponds to the Spirit. Jesus says that the one who is born of the Spirit blows where he will, because the Spirit corresponds to wind. It's the same word. And the Spirit goes place to place in almost an instant. This is what we see happening in the prophetic period, which begins with Elijah, and then it leads forward into the exile, and then Israel is spread to the 4 winds of heaven. Because the whole nation has, in a sense, become prophetic. I'll say more about that in just a moment. When we see Elijah and Elisha, what is it that we see? Before we had court prophets. These are prophets who operated in basically one place, and they gave words to the king. Or whomever was ruling in Jerusalem. In the prophetic period, we have that expanded outwards. And Elijah and Elisha, they go from place to place. Elisha goes to the nations. He blows where he wishes. The later prophets, the writing prophets, send out letters to the nations. You look at the oracles against the nations, and Hosea and Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah, these were not just given to Israel, they were sending these out to the nations, just as Elisha had went to Hazael, who was the king of Syria. That's a very, very important point. The prophetic period is where you go to the Gentiles. There was, of course, Gentile conversion before then, but it generally happened when the Gentiles came to Israel. All nations came to Solomon and learned wisdom from him. Now the prophets are sending letters to the nations, and they're actually going to the nations. Daniel is sent out to be a counselor to the king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar converts. And then after the exile, Israel goes out and they're spread out as the four winds of heaven. The four horsemen in Zechariah and then Revelation, those are the people of God. These are the four winds of heaven. The spirit wind of God in Ezekiel 8 went and dwelled with the exiles, made them all wind, and then they blew around the Gentile world, being a witness to the Gentile nations, which is why, by the time of Jesus, you have Gentiles attaching themselves to the synagogue. These are the Gentile God-fearers. They're not circumcised, they're not a part of the people of Israel, but they're righteous and they worship the true God. In the period of the New Testament, we see those two being integrated together into one body. There's no more distinction between Jew and Gentile. And so that's what happens in the priestly, the royal, and the prophetic period. And of course, the prophetic period corresponds to the Spirit, because the Spirit is the wind of God, and we have Gentile witness and stuff like that. So, I spent a lot of time talking about this, but what does it have to do with statehood? What does it have to do with the system of government? Well, here's what I think it has to do. In the priestly period of covenant history, and remember, this is a spiral. It's not as if it's just the Mosaic covenant, which cycles through priestly, kingly, and prophetic. This is something which begins with the creation of Adam and goes through several ascending spirals. This is something which happens over and over again. I'll talk about one more example of that in a bit. But what does this have to do with statehood? Well, remember what I said about statehood being a function of the social order. Why don't we have kings and judges? What's going on? Well, the reason is because the nation Israel is a nation, it is a people. They speak a common language, and language corresponds to peoplehood. Why? Because peoplehood is about a common culture, and language allows for cultural flow. You read the same literature, you can talk to each other, you're able to explain concepts that you think about to others, but if you don't speak that language, you cannot enter into a direct understanding of that culture. So nationhood is about language. Of course, we see that in the Tower of Babel, and language allows for cultural flow. So there's a nation that is in the land of Israel, but there is not a central state. The judges were not sitting on a throne ruling over all Israel. And Deuteronomy gives us regulations for the governance of Israel. And what you see in Deuteronomy is that it's the elders of the gate who do the judging. It's the Levites who do the judging. You have cities and tribes which are spread across this land, and they're engaged with each other because they speak the same language, they can talk to each other, but you don't have a single central state. If you see in Judges, the tribe of Benjamin has to be essentially destroyed, and this is a gathering of the tribes which does this. Benjamin is governing itself independently at this point in history. So you have what we would today call city-states, or people out in the land. And it's the elders of the gate in each locality who are doing the day-to-day business of governing the nation. At special periods in history, God will call a judge, and the judge will liberate a part of Israel from foreign domination, and then they might circle around the land, rendering verdicts on very specific cases. But there's not a regular central government which has united the people under a single state. So why are the people eventually united under a single state? Well, I want you to understand that maturation, which corresponds to kingship, glorification, which corresponds to kingship, and then prophethood, has to do with the integration of things. God first creates pairs. He creates heaven and earth. He creates male and female, land and sea, and so on. And eventually those pairs are integrated together. They're integrated into a single thing. So in Ephesians, we hear about Christ in his incarnation, death, resurrection, and ascension. He integrates heaven and earth into one. In Revelation, we see the city of God, which is from heaven, permanently binding heaven and earth together. Man and woman, they're separate, but they come together, they become one flesh. And in so doing, they are glorified. That is why Israel normally cannot wear mixed fabrics. Mixed fabrics are not unclean. They are not unclean. They are holy. And that is why you're not supposed to plant two kinds of seed in one field. Because if you do that, if you integrate those two kinds of seed together, the whole field is going to be holy, and you can't eat the food. It has to all go to the tabernacle, because the tabernacle is the only place where that level of holiness is allowed. But the high priest wears an entire mixed fabric. The high priest is a symbol of Christ. He is both priest, prophet, and king. He's priest, obviously, as an Aaronic priest. He is king because he's got a crown, and he's prophet because on his breastplate, which matches the heart, you have the Urim and Thummim. That's where God gives revelation through the Spirit, and a prophet is somebody who has the Spirit in them. That's a very important point, I believe. So integration of things, oneness, unity in diversity, that corresponds to development and glorification. Now, Deuteronomy, as a book, in terms of Israel's journey from Egypt to the land, Deuteronomy as a book is about the second giving of the law. It's about a glorification of the law. God first dictated the law in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Moses has digested that for 38 years. He's thought about it and meditated on it. Then in Deuteronomy, he gives a sermon on it. He reasons out the implications of God's word in the law. It's about a glorified society. We hear about parents passing on wisdom to their children. This is about the development of the human race, the development of Israel, its growth from a seed into a tree which will be planted on God's holy mountain. That maturation comes to its climax in the New Covenant with the remnant according to the election of grace, which St. Paul speaks of. So Deuteronomy is about this glorification. Now, Deuteronomy is also about oneness. This word one is very important. The Shema is a thematic verse which casts its light over the whole book. It's, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. The Lord is one." And the one God, which is covenantally bound to Israel, corresponds to one place of worship. Deuteronomy 12. There is a central sanctuary. Now, some liberal scholars say, well, this is a coded way of referring to Jerusalem, because they believe that Deuteronomy is a forgery under Josiah, who was trying to stimulate economic growth for Jerusalem. They really believe this. So they think it was a forgery, and they think the place which the Lord your God shall choose is just a coded way of referring to Jerusalem, but that is not the case. The reason it doesn't name the city is because the central sanctuary is moved around in the Old Covenant. Jeremiah speaks of Shiloh, the place where the Lord first set his name. Shiloh is one of the locations of the tabernacle in the period of the Judges. Eventually, the tabernacle is separated from the Ark of the Covenant. God divides something in two, and then the Ark of the Covenant is reunited on Mount Moriah, and it is reunited in glorified form. So the sanctuary moves from place to place. But the important point is that there's one sanctuary. And at the one sanctuary, the different tribes of Israel are supposed to gather 3 times a year. And that gathering is what produces the integration of the 12 into the one. They are given a deeper unity than they had before. And that is facilitated how? By worship. By worship. You become what you worship. There's one God in 3 persons. Thus, you become one people, each with many distinct kinds of people, by worshiping the one God. So that is how oneness corresponds to the sanctuary. It's how oneness corresponds to Deuteronomy. And it's in Deuteronomy where it gives the laws of kingship. Deuteronomy 17 says, when you wish to set a king over yourself, you may do so. Set it over from among your brothers. The whole nation is integrated into a single unit, and then there's one king to rule over that one nation. But the point here is that the monarchy only comes about at a period in history where Israel is prepared. They need to have a certain degree of unity in order to facilitate that one state, that one king. Before, you just have various cities and various peoples who are judged at a local level. So what exactly is it that happens in the book of Samuel? Now, some people think that Samuel is anti-monarchical, at least parts of it. Liberal scholars, as unimaginative as they are, they think that there's an anti-monarchical source in Samuel, which represents 1 Samuel 8, where Samuel warns about the coming king. And then there's the pro-monarchical source, which glorifies the exploits of David. And American Christians have used 1 Samuel 8 to argue against monarchy in principle. Now the problem is, this is essentially the only passage in the Bible which can be interpreted to argue against monarchy in principle. The Bible, as a book, is very pro-monarchical, and I'll point out the period of Judges had nothing to do with democracy or republicanism. It was just, it was about more localism. The localism persists in the Bible, but there's a central state which integrates the whole nation into one. So what exactly happened in 1 Samuel 8? Well, the key thing here is that there is a specific curse which is placed on the line of Judah because of the sexual sin that took place in Genesis chapter 38, where Judah went into someone whom he thought was a cult prostitute. Now, according to the laws of Deuteronomy, the descendants of such a union have to wait a certain period of time, in this case 10 generations, in order to enter into the sanctity of God's throne. Remember, the palace is the temple, same word. The palace of the human king is a temple, and then the temple of God is God's palace, the palace of the divine king. Those two are united, of course, in the coming of Jesus, who's both the son of David and the incarnation of the Word of God. And so there was a 10-generation waiting period. Israel was supposed to know that the king would come from the line of Judah because we're told that in Genesis 49. They're given regulations for kingship in Deuteronomy 17, which makes it very strange if God was against kingship in principle, but there had to be a waiting period. And so in the book of Ruth, which I believe was written by Samuel, together with the book of Judges, book of Ruth gives us a genealogy from Judah to David at the end. And that makes clear that David is the 10th generation. He is the person who is able to enter into that throne. Now in 1 Samuel 8, God had not yet allowed them to put a king on the throne. They had not yet integrated to the level they were supposed to integrate. And this is a very important point because we see little sins in the book of Judges eventually produce large problems in Samuel and Kings. In Judges, there is a particular part of land which is not fully conquered. It's a little note that's given in the first chapter. James Jordan, in his commentary on Judges, which is free online, it's on Gary North's website, speaks of this. Now, it's this little piece of land, and it seems like this is not a big deal. But what it does is it separates Judah's border from the borders of other tribes of Israel. Now, the Bible had already spoken of Israel and Judah as a bit distinct. The northern tribes, the 10 tribes, remember Levi was spread throughout the land, but the northern tribes were called Israel. Why? Because Jacob said in Genesis, I believe it's Genesis chapter 8, these are the sons through whom my name will pass. And he's speaking of the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And that is what Jacob's name is, of course, Israel. That's why they're called Israel. Then there's also Judah, who is the royal tribe who was selected from among his brothers, and he's a special son. But because this border was separated from the other tribes, what it meant is that the degree of cultural integration had been reduced, which meant when Judah was supposed to take his seat, or before they were supposed to take Judah, there were problems among the tribes. When Israel seizes kingship, remember Adam also seized kingship. God wanted him to wait, he wanted him to become wise, and then he was supposed to become a king. He was supposed to inherit the world. Jesus first is patient, then he inherits the world. Tree of knowledge of good and evil, it's kingship. 1 Kings 3 speaks of discerning good and evil as a property of wisdom by which kings rule, as Solomon says in Proverbs. And when Samuel speaks of the problem of the king, he says, this king whom you will choose. It's not about kings in general, it's about this king. And when Saul does come to the throne, he has not been through a death and resurrection experience. David goes through a death and resurrection experience. His death happens as he has to flee throughout the land from Saul. He's separated from his home. He's separated from his family. Saul is trying to kill him. And that produces wisdom. Just like Joseph. Joseph is taken from his family. He's thrown into prison. He's sold as a slave. But then he becomes wise through suffering, as Hebrews says of Jesus, who through suffering was qualified to be the king of the world. Saul had not been through such an experience. He was a good man. He was a humble man. But he had not been through that experience. And what that meant is that he eventually fell. And after his fall, he goes around the land and he unjustly murders people. He slays the priests of Nob, who are Gibeonites, and God had made a covenant with them that they would be an ascension on God's altar. That's in Joshua chapter, I believe it's chapter 8 or 9. Can't remember exactly. Now, what this does is it creates tension among the tribes of Israel. There is a civil war which happens when David comes to the throne. David becomes king in Hebron. Then Saul and his son Ishbal, who is called in Samuel Ishbosheth, which is a slur on the name Baal, there's a civil war, and that produces problems between two different parts of the kingdom of Israel. They were supposed to be one people, one integrated nation, which is why they could have one king who united all the different localities, but because of the sin of Saul and the civil war which resulted between the two dynasties, that didn't happen. And so what do we see later in Samuel? We see that there are complaints about David. Now, there are sons of Belial, seed of the serpent, sons of Belial. Baal was Satan in the Bible. That's very important. Belial, that's a reference to Bel, who is Baal, seed of the serpent. What they do is when there are people who are coming to the throne in order to ask for justice, they turn people who are not from the tribe of Judah away, and they say, David is only hearing cases from his own tribe. And this produces tension because people think he's giving Judah favoritism. They had not yet become one to the degree they were supposed to. So these sons of Belial saw we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse, and another war happens, and David has to reconquer the land. But these intertribal tensions are eventually what produces the division of the kingdom in the Book of Kings. Solomon is from the tribe of Judah. The leading tribe among 10 tribes, it's Ephraim, who is the son of Joseph. Remember, Joseph has a double tribe. He's given one of the blessings of the firstborn. The other blessing is given to Judah. But he's got a double tribe, Ephraim and Manasseh. Well, what does it say? It says Solomon, who is of the tribe of Judah, enslaved the leading tribe of the house of Israel, the northern kingdom. He has forced labor over the house of Joseph. And so these intra-tribal tensions produce a division of the kingdom. So Jeroboam is then told by God, you go and you establish your own throne, and I will bless you if you are faithful. So the kingdom is divided in two. So my point in saying all this is to show you the deep connection between kingship, one throne, one central government, which unites the different localities, and oneness. Kingship and oneness, those two are very deeply connected. So in the first period, the priestly period, you've got different localities which are ruled at a local level, and those different localities, they've ruled at a local level, and under the kingly period, you have one nation. Okay, so priestly period, you've got one nation, one people, speak the same language, have the same culture, basically, but they are ruled differently from locality to locality. In kingship, you've got a regular state, which has central control, one nation, one state. And then, in the prophetic period, you have one state, many nations. The prophetic period is an imperial period. Now, as Peter Leithart has pointed out, the Bible is not a wholly anti-imperial book. It's very trendy today because of the end of the era of colonialism. Very trendy to talk about anti-imperialism in the Bible. And there are some cases where the Bible critiques certain empires. But in principle, it's not an anti-imperial book. There are empires of which God speaks very positively. And the prophetic period in Israel's covenant history is the period of the exile and the return from exile. So Elijah begins this period because he prepares a remnant. He's like John the Baptist. He prepares a remnant from the northern kingdom so that when they're sent into Syria, there will be God-fearing people who will then return. Remember, there were no 10 lost tribes. They came back with Judah, which is why we see a prophetess in Luke who is from the tribe of Asher, which is a northern tribe. Okay, so that period, it's the exile and the return from exile. Now, what happens in this period? You've got empires. The first empire you have is Assyria. Assyria, it goes through different nations and it conquers them. So there's one state with many different nations, many different peoples. Jonah is sent to Nineveh, which is a major city in Assyria. Why is he sent to Nineveh? Well, there's a connection in the book between a great fish and the same word then, a great city, the great city being Nineveh. Now, what is the great fish? The great fish is a protection for Jonah when he goes into the sea. Exile is spoken of as a flood in the book of Jeremiah. Jonah is protected by a great fish when he goes into the sea, and then he comes out of the sea and evangelizes it to the Gentiles. Same thing with the northern kingdom's exile. Jonah's conversion of the city of Nineveh gives a cushion for Israel when they're sent into exile. There are God-fearers with whom they can engage, who will help them when the northern kingdom is exiled to Assyria. And then Daniel, of course, does the same thing. He goes to Nebuchadnezzar, he converts the king of Babylon, and then when Israel is exiled, there are God-fearing people there. And then the Persians are what we today call Zoroastrians, but it wasn't yet called that, and the centrality of Zoroaster is disputed. It may be that he was not even a part of the faith at this point, but this is just Gentile God-fearing. They worship a creator God who is transcendent and rules over the world and commands justice for the nations. They call it Aramazda. This is a name for the true God, just like Shangti, the Emperor of Heaven, is a name for the true God in China. So the kings of Persia worship this God, and Israel and Judah are protected by the king. We see that in Ezra and Nehemiah. The king helps to build the temple. He speaks of the God of heaven. Heaven symbolizes sovereignty. The lights are rulers in the heavens. So the God of heaven is the sovereign God over the nations. It's a Gentile name for God, as we've spoken of before. But the imperial period is where you got one state, and it incorporates many peoples, many nations. And this is what we see in this period of history. Daniel 2 shows us the way the history is going to work. You've got 4 empires, 4 kingdoms given in Daniel 2, symbolized by 4 metals. Now, just like Jonah and his great fish, this symbolizes a protective house for Israel. These 4 metals, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, these are the order of metals which you see in the temple. In Daniel 2, this statue is both considered as a single unit. The whole statue symbolizes this order, the ecumene, which is going to persist until the time of the Lord Jesus. He calls this times of the Gentiles, times of the nations. And each metal also symbolizes a different kingdom. So there's Babylon, then there's Persia, there's Greece, which is 4. In Daniel 7, we're showing Greece as a 4-headed beast because there are 4 subsets in that. The subsets are Alexander himself, then there is the Ptolemies, then there's the Syrians, and then finally there is Rome, because Rome was founded by those associated with the Greeks according to Roman tradition. Most historians dismiss that. I don't. I think it's an accurate tradition. So Rome has very many similarities with Hellenistic culture. There never was a period where Rome was not Hellenized in some respect. And they are under the rule of the Roman Republic, which is distinguished from the Roman Empire, through the Hasmoneans, who were clients of the Romans, because the Hasmoneans fought against the Syrians, who under Antiochus IV came against God and came against Jerusalem. And then finally there's the Roman Empire, which is the Iron Kingdom, and that's what we see in the New Testament. Until the time of Nero, remember, the Roman Empire essentially protected the church, as these imperial powers were supposed to do. The book of Acts, the Jews often come against Paul, they come against Christians, the Romans step in, they say, what the hell are you guys doing? When Paul is whipped, he says, I'm a Roman citizen, and they're very nervous because they know that Rome protects its citizens. The Bible does not give a wholesale critique of the Romans. It's a much more complex picture. My point here is basically that the imperial period is many nations, one rule. But the many nations preserve their distinct character. This was really central to the Persian conception of what God had asked the kings to do. You see many inscriptions and many pictures of speaking of the many nations which were united and conquered by the Persian king. And the many nations brought their own unique gifts to help build these cities. This is emphasized over and over again in the archaeological evidence. There's unity, one state, in diversity, many nations ruled under that one state. And that is the essential biblical pattern of political history, if you want to call it that. First, period of city-states, where one nation is ruled by many different governments. They have a cultural unity. They can talk to each other. They engage with one another. But there's not a central state, at least not a regular central state. Then you've got a kingly period where they're one nation that's integrated together, and there's one state which unites them all. And when I say that society and state, they have to be considered together, I say that because the state is the linchpin of the unity of the society. It's not nearly as certain libertarians would say, and I also wanted to point out, I'm libertarian in many respects, but certain libertarians would say the state only has a protective role. To preserve life, liberty, and property, and thus by implication it wouldn't exist if there had been no fall. But I say the state has a larger role than that. It serves to network the society together and provide its structure. So Joshua speaks of highways being created by the state. Obviously, it's not highway in our modern sense, but it's a way to unite the society together. Solomon initiates building projects in which all the 12 tribes participate, and so on and so forth. So that's the kingly period. And then the prophetic period is an imperial period where there's one state and there are many nations. So then the question I would want to ask about the third one is, how does a Christian empire get created? Because we would say that wars of conquest are generally wrong, with a couple exceptions in the Bible, where God had specifically commanded a war of conquest. But how is it created otherwise? Now, I haven't fully developed my answer to this question, but I would make a couple points. I would say first, you expand your control when another people comes against you, they attack you, and then you counterattack. Under those circumstances, you're allowed to annex territory. That commandment is given in Deuteronomy 25, I believe the chapter is. If another city comes against you, you counterattack. And you're supposed to, when you've beaten them all the way back to the city, you're supposed to offer them terms of peace. If they give you peace, you levy tribute on them. It says you enslave them, but that word slavery really has to do with tribute. And the reason tribute is taken is because it's reparations. The central aspect of biblical justice is restitution, so the city offers you tribute as restitution, as war reparations to pay your war debt. But you've annexed this city now. You've expanded control. So you control Israel, and the other you control certain Gentile nations. I would also say that sometimes empires can be created without force. This is when a nation freely enters into association with your state. This actually happens in Roman history. There were certain city-states where the king, in his will, left the Roman Republic in control of. So they entered into the Roman network. Remember, the Roman Empire is really an aggregate of cities. It doesn't have borders in the way that we think of it. There are certain cities who are in certain degrees of relationship with the Roman Empire. And not all of them had the same kind of relationship. The Romans had three different categories for being in a formal covenantal relationship with Rome. You could be a citizen. You could have Roman status. You could be of Latin status. And then there were others who were not of Roman nor Latin status. And they had different ways that they governed themselves and different ways they related to Rome. To give a secular example today, now I don't support the European Union, but the reason I don't support it is because I think there are two reasons. First, it's secular, so I can't support that. If it were Christian, it would be a different story. Second, I think that they do want to actually homogenize the different cultures. And the Bible speaks of unity in diversity. Many nations is a good thing, but you're not supposed to homogenize them. By the way, do not take that as me saying that people of different ethnic backgrounds cannot marry each other, because I don't believe that. I believe it is fine for people of different ethnic backgrounds to marry each other as long as they're Christian. So I just had to throw that in because I don't want to be misrepresented. But something like the European Union is foreshadowed in the Holy Roman Empire. Many different nations, many different languages, but they're united under a single emperor. And it was kind of decentralized. There are different electoral areas which would elect the king. Now, the election really was by custom. You pick the... So that's another way you can have a Christian empire. The third way, I would say, is the king, or the emperor, converts on the throne. That's what happens to Constantine. So that creates the Christian empire of Byzantium. So That is essentially how I see the development and the maturation of society over time. The kind of government generally has to do with the way that different localities relate to one another. The kind of government really does not have to do with a difference between democracy or traditional monarchy or whatever. Um, the Bible generally envisions there being one ruler over whatever locale it is, and he has something like a senate. There are certain elders of the gates who govern together with the king of a city. Remember, there are kings of city-states. See that in the period of Abraham. As a conclusion, I just want to give you one more example of this triple development in history. Remember how I said that priestly, kingly, and prophetic, they spiral upwards? So you see this after the flood. After the flood, there's a priestly, a kingly, and a prophetic period. The priestly period is the time from Noah to the time of Nimrod, who establishes the kingdom of Babylon. And after the Tower of Babel is destroyed, there are still various kingdoms which he establishes. And then from the period of Nimrod to the period of Joseph, that's when you see an imperial period. That's where you see a prophetic period. The prophetic, or pardon me, not from Nimrod to Joseph, but from Nimrod to Abraham. That begins a prophetic period. And there are many connections between the patriarchal period and the period after the return from exile and the book of Daniel. For example, Joseph is a new Daniel. They're both thrown in pits. They both convert Gentile kings. They both proclaim the word of God to Gentile nations, and so on and so forth. That's where there's so many similarities there. There are corresponding periods of covenant history. So the patriarchal period is a prophetic period, and that prepares the world for the transfiguration of the covenant in the beginning of a new cycle at Sinai. That's also an aspect of the prophetic period. The prophetic period foreshadows the transfiguration and glorification of the cycle. So the period after the return from exile in Israel's history has many, many similarities to the new covenant under Jesus as our emperor. And so the way that these correspond to the different visions of the state, which I've set forth, is as follows. The first thing you see is from Noah to Nimrod. You've got many different nations. You've got many families of nations. You see that in Genesis chapter 10. There's 70 nations specifically divided by God, and they have 70 languages. These, I believe, are the language families which we know today, of which there are about, what do you know, 70. The reason that there are only a few language families which have many languages in them is because certain languages get spread and spread and spread and get adopted by more and more people. But you see about 70 language families, which is very, very interesting. And it's very hard to put those language families into a kind of tree of languages because they seem to be very distinct from one another. You can create a tree for Indo-European languages, but you can't do that for Indo-European languages and Afro-Asiatic languages together, which I think is very interesting. And I think it corresponds with what the Bible tells us about the Tower of Babel and the kind of culture that was created after God scattered the languages. Anyway, you've got many nations, but they don't each have a single king. As they spread across the earth, there are different city-states, which we see that they form. This is the kind of thing that the Romans encountered as they expanded their control. The different tribes were not united under a single kingdom. There were various cities and various communities which spoke a common language and had a common culture, but they didn't have a single unified government. So you have that, and then under Nimrod, after the Babel project is destroyed, where he tries to create an empire, and he fails, but after the Babel project is destroyed, he creates kingdoms. The Bible speaks of him creating 2 world kingdoms. Those 2 world kingdoms each have 4 cities corresponding to 4 corners of the earth, but there are different kingdoms at this point. That's the world in which Abraham enters. When Abraham enters the scene, there's a kingdom of Egypt. There's a Philistine kingdom. You see those different, and you also have in Canaan a kingdom which is ruled over by Kedorlaomer. Now, as we see in the period of the patriarchs, that is transitioning into an imperial period. So Genesis 14 tells us the geopolitical order of the time. Kedorlaomer, who's a Shemite king, is ruling over many different areas in the land of Canaan. It's moving into an imperial period. Pharaoh's kingdom becomes an empire, as we see throughout the book of Genesis. And under Joseph, Pharaoh's kingdom attains its great imperial status. Now, I believe that, now, I can't prove this to you, but I believe it for certain reasons having to do with biblical chronology and also do some archaeological evidence. I think the Old Kingdom of Egypt and the Middle Kingdom of Egypt really need to be integrated into a single period, to a single period of time, as Donovan Corville said. But I believe that the cultural foundations for the rise of Old Kingdom Egypt were laid by Joseph. And that's what allowed it to dominate the Near East. And then the New Kingdom, first there's the Exodus, which destroys the Old/Middle Kingdom, and then the New Kingdom rises from the dust after the Hyksos are kicked out, and the Hyksos are the Amalekites, which is why in Samuel we see Egypt and the Amalekites reappear on the scene at the same time. The reason the Hyksos don't appear in the Near East after they're kicked out by Amos is because Saul kills all of them in 1 Samuel 15. But anyway, the end of Genesis shows Egypt becoming the imperial power under Joseph. Why? Because there's a famine which strikes not just Egypt, but the whole world, and we're told that all the peoples of the earth came to Pharaoh to get food. And the thing is, if you depend on another nation for your trade, if you depend on them for your economy, you have to be in a certain position of subordination. Nations attain hegemony through their economies. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It does not have to do with the military. People think it has to do with the military because when you have a large economy, you can fund a large military, and then the nation overextends itself and it declines. But the large military is just something which it correlates with, but does not cause a nation's hegemony. It's the economic growth which causes their hegemony. Look at China. Why is China rising? Because its economy is growing, and many nations are dependent on it for trade. But that's how Egypt becomes the empire that it became in that great period of its history, in the Old Kingdom period, because the other nations had to depend on Egypt to buy food, and so they extended their dominion over the Near East. So that's another example of the three different sections of this cycle. And I think you see that in the Christian era as well, by the way, but I'm not going to get into that at the moment. Well, thank you very much for listening. My Patreon, as always, is linked below, and I will see you, God willing, tomorrow. I know I haven't made a video in a while, but hoping to get back on the saddle. So, thanks a lot.